Well, good morning, and thank you very much for the invitation to join you on your anniversary service. Oh, this is loud. 376 years, that's not bad. In fact, you are one of the older churches, Baptist churches in the country, and much to celebrate over the past decades and centuries. And church anniversaries are a good opportunity both to look back with thanksgiving and reflection, to ask, where have we been? What have we been doing? What have we been learning? What has God been saying to us, doing with us? But also, of course, an opportunity to look forward. It's really like New Year's Day, when you sort of look back to the previous year, then look forward to the coming year and think about what might come next. But of course, the last year or two have been unlike any previous years that we've experienced. Challenges, changes, pain, suffering, all sorts of things that have been difficult for us and difficult for communities such as this. And so our reflection is tinged with all sorts of things as we look back and begin to ask, where do we go from here? And I work with lots of different churches in different contexts, and already I'm picking up two major trends. Some churches just desperate to get back to the way things were, preferably without masks, preferably able to gather more closely together. But basically, let's find a way back to the way we were doing things before. But other churches who are saying the last thing we want to do is to go back to the way things were. It's not that it was all bad, but we sense this as an opportunity. I've had a number of conversations recently with church leaders who are saying, I am desperate that we don't simply go back to the way things were. We take this opportunity, perhaps a once-in-a-generation opportunity, to say, what might we be as a community? What might we do? What might God be saying to us? So I wonder where you are in Dorchester this morning. Wanting to go back to the way things were, wanting to move on to something new, or perhaps a mixture of views. This morning we're going to listen in to a conversation in the church in Jerusalem many centuries ago, when essentially they were also facing that sort of question. Do we carry on the way we were, or are we open to new possibilities and new challenges? I suspect many of you know the story pretty well. This is a major story in the book of Acts. Luke, the author, seems to think this is a significant moment in the story he's telling. And he tells the story of Peter and Cornelius at length and twice. And we've read the second telling. This is Peter's version of it. In Luke 10, Luke simply spells out, in Acts 10, Luke simply spells out the story, what happened when Peter went to the house of Cornelius. Here, Peter has come back to his home church in Jerusalem, and he's trying to explain what has happened, because he knows that it's going to be tough for the church. They're going to hear things that will make them uncomfortable. So be warned, this is an uncomfortable passage this morning. Discomfort's going to be one of the themes. So I hope you're sitting comfortably. So there's no doubt that Luke sees this as a pivotal moment in the story of the development of the early church. And that's why he tells the story twice and at length. Something has happened which is going to change everything if the church responds in certain ways. So what's the big deal? What's happened that is causing this discomfort? Well, the problem is Cornelius. Cornelius has got converted. And Cornelius should not have got converted, because he's not like us. He is a full-blown, card-carrying, pork-eating Gentile. And such people should not be converted or in the church. He's a Gentile. But the gospel's for the Jews, isn't it? This is a Jewish church in Jerusalem. Everybody shares the same culture, the same worldview. And now you've got Cornelius. What on earth are we going to do with Cornelius? In fact, the question before that is, what on earth has Peter been up to? Because you know what Peter's like. Well, if you read the Gospels, you know exactly what Peter's like. Sometimes wonderful and sometimes a complete idiot. Which is it this time? What has happened? Peter's been preaching the gospel to Gentiles. And worse still, God seems to have showed up. Worse still, the Spirit seems to have fallen on these Gentiles. This is the Gentile Pentecost. What are we going to do about this? Because really up to now, I think the Jerusalem church had assumed that the gospel was simply for the Jews. It was for those who were like them. It wasn't for people like Cornelius. If you read back 2 or 3 chapters, you find that Samaritans had already been drawn into the faith. And that was bad enough, but at least they were half Jewish. You could sort of let them slip in. But there's no doubt about Cornelius. He is 100% Gentile. And worse, he's a Roman. Worse still, he's a centurion. He's part of the occupying army that is polluting the Holy Land and is oppressing Peter's people. He is the enemy. Peter in Acts 10 is in the house of his enemy. He is uncomfortable. And so even though the Jerusalem church is beginning to feel uncomfortable, as Peter tells the story, it's nothing compared with the discomfort Peter felt when he was in the house of Cornelius. He was in the house of his enemy. And it's interesting, if you read back to Acts chapter 10, to see what the heart of his message was. He spoke about Jesus who brought the message of peace. Peace in the house of the enemy. To get an idea of just how strange this environment is, you need to think about, what should we say, an Afghan evangelist bringing the good news to the Pentagon. Can you get your head around that? That's what's going on here. It just shouldn't have happened. And Peter knew it shouldn't have happened, and the Jerusalem church knew it shouldn't have happened, but somehow it had, and they had to work out what to do. Now, there have been warnings of this sort of thing in the ministry of Jesus. I wonder whether you can think of any. Any reasons why in the ministry of Jesus Peter might have suddenly gone, I see. Do you remember the other centurion that Jesus met? And he said, I haven't found faith like this in all of Israel, which probably would have offended everybody around him. Do you remember Jesus' words about loving your enemy? Well, here's an opportunity. Do you remember the Great Commission? Go and make disciples of all nations. But surely that only means the Jews who are scattered through the nations, doesn't it? Apparently not. So the idea that Gentiles could become followers of Jesus took the Jerusalem church way beyond their comfort zone. It challenged their worldview, it challenged their understanding of God, their understanding of mission. Everything seemed to be up for grabs. In many ways, I think it was much harder for the Jerusalem church than it was for Peter. Peter, after all, had seen the vision from heaven, that strange vision of animals coming down from heaven. He'd heard the voice from heaven telling him to kill and eat. He'd been in the house of Cornelius. He'd witnessed what had happened. He'd seen the unmistakable signs of God's Spirit at work, even though he wasn't sure that it should have happened. And so for the Jerusalem church, it was even harder because all they had was Peter's report. And they knew Peter, and they knew what he was like. What are they going to make of it? So we're listening in to a kind of church meeting, really, a conversation where the church is deciding how to respond. What do we do with Peter's report? Do we accept it or don't we? And if we do accept it, what are the implications? And you get the sense that Peter is rather uncertain how his report is going to be received. He's not sure he can persuade them. And perhaps in a kind of defense mode, he talks about God a lot. And you find that pioneers often do that, mainly because they don't know what else to say, because they're in situations where they're unsure, but it just seems that God is turning up. And so he says that God spoke to him, verse 7. The Spirit told him to go to Cornelius' house, verse 12. The Spirit came on the Gentiles, verse 15. God gave them the gift of tongues, verse 17. So really Peter's saying it's not my fault. This is God's fault. And I don't actually like it much more than you do, but we've got to do something about this. And he plays down his role in the whole situation. He says to them, I'd only just started speaking. Now, if you go back to Acts 10, you find he's been going for quite some time, actually. So I wonder whether it's the preacher's perspective. I think I've just started. You're wondering how much longer is he going to go on? I'd only just started, he said. But what he's really saying is, it wasn't my great sermon. I didn't do anything. I just started, and then God came and did all this strange stuff. And then he poses this rather troubling question for the church. If God has done this, don't we need to make sure we don't oppose what God is doing? We don't want to get in the way of what God's up to, do we? And you can sense the sort of atmosphere perhaps in the meeting changing at that point as people think, that is a bit of a challenge. So how did the church respond? How did the church at Dorchester respond when the pioneer came back and said, God's been doing all these strange things? Well, the church in Jerusalem responded, first of all, with criticisms. They weren't really happy with this. And interestingly, they were more concerned that Peter had eaten in the house of Cornelius than he'd baptized all these Gentiles. Strange sometimes, the things that people get worried about when new things happen. But of course, that was against all the Jewish food laws. He should not have been eating in the house of Cornelius. They've got questions. They want to know more of what had happened. They begin to probe and ask questions. But as the story continues, we discover that they receive Peter's report. They acknowledge that, God has been up to something. And they get to the point where they're prepared to say, so then, God has granted even the Gentiles repentance unto life. Even the Gentiles, even everybody in the world who isn't like us, God loves as well. I detect a certain degree of reticence still, even the Gentiles. It's not wholehearted enthusiasm, but they're there. They've made the step. They have recognized that this is God pushing them beyond their comfort zone. Why is this incident so significant, and what can we learn from it? Why does Luke tell the story twice and at such length? I think primarily because it challenges the church's understanding of God and of God's mission. This is opening up a whole new vista. This is going to transform the way they think about what God is doing, what mission is like. But it's also very significant because it's going to change the church. And mission has a tendency to do that. If you get involved in mission, the church can't really stay the same. And the church at Jerusalem will not be the same from now on. What has been a Jewish community is fairly soon going to become a mixed community in which the Jewish Christians will actually be the minority. That's the challenge. That's the cost of saying yes to what God is doing here. But it meant that global mission got a boost. It actually meant that the good news has reached us. Gentiles, most of us, I imagine. So that's the story. What relevance has that got for us today as we slowly emerge out of pandemic, as we begin to ask what might the next months and years hold? I wonder whether we can do something this morning. I don't like monologues, and I've just given you a bit of a monologue. I would want to encourage you just for 2 or 3 minutes to have a conversation with the person next to you. Now, I realise that 1 or 2 of you are sitting distanced from somebody else, so I don't know whether you're allowed to move under restrictions or whether you'll just have to sit quietly and think, but some of you are close enough. I wonder whether you might just have a quick conversation for 2 or 3 minutes. I'm not going to ask you to say anything publicly. What do you think this passage might have to say to you in this church today, going forward, on your anniversary Sunday? How might this be relevant? What might the challenge be to move beyond the comfort zone? Are you happy to do that? It's optional. I mean, if you'd rather not, just sit quietly and dream of something. But if you're happy to, just have a quick conversation. Any ideas? I've never been to your church before. I don't think I've ever been to Dorchester before. So I didn't know whether I was allowed to do what I've just done or not, whether this was okay in the church, or whether it's pushing you beyond your comfort zone even to do that. But I thought since I'm here as a guest and going away again, probably won't matter too much. So thank you for that. And actually, one of the things that happens when you start talking about what you're hearing rather than just listening is it actually changes the way that you engage with it. I suspect you might remember more this morning through just that 3 or 4 minutes of conversation than just simply listening passively. I tend to do that wherever I am, so I irritate churches all over the place. So what are some of the questions? This may overlap with things you said to each other. What might it mean for your church, my church, churches generally, to move beyond our comfort zone? What would be the practical outworkings of that? What assumptions have we made that might need to be challenged? Second question would be, do we have pioneers within this community People like Peter, who will engage with people who are beyond the church, different from most of us, people perhaps who were not expecting to respond. What do we do with pioneers? Churches don't always know what to do with pioneers. And part of the reason is that the gap between a pioneer and a pain in the neck is very thin. You're never quite sure what you're dealing with. But actually, we need pioneers. We need prophetic pioneers. And we need them now as we move into a new phase beyond pandemic. But pioneers can be awkward people, difficult to know what to do with. I hope this is a church where pioneers are welcomed, affirmed, encouraged, nurtured, released. Third question, do we believe that God is at work outside the church as well as within it? That was a real shock for Peter to discover that God was already there in the house of Cornelius before he turned up. An angel had spoken to him. What's an angel doing in the house of a Roman centurion, you might ask? Don't angels know where they should be? But it seems that God breaks the boundaries and works in all sorts of strange places. And how might we respond in this church, in any church, when God brings to us people who are different from us, significantly different? Do we expect them to become like us, to conform to our ways of doing things? Or will we allow ourselves to be transformed by our encounters with them? Because that's what happened with Jerusalem church. They became different. And there's a big conversation, if you read on a few chapters in Acts 15, how Jewish do these Gentile converts need to be? How much of our culture do they need to embrace if we want to welcome them? Important questions. So this story is all about discomfort. Peter struggled to understand the vision that God showed him. And I hope you get how difficult this was for Peter. So he had a vision of unclean animals and a voice from heaven telling him to disobey the Old Testament. God telling him to disobey the Bible. How's that for discomfort? Peter, kill and eat these animals that centuries ago I told your people not to eat. What do you do with that? This is uncomfortable stuff. Peter's very uncomfortable in the house of Cornelius. He doesn't really want to be there. He's actually got 6 people with him. He's taken a group to make sure that, he's okay. And actually, I think so. He's got witnesses that he can say to the Jerusalem church, these brothers can also tell you what happened. It wasn't just me. He's disturbed by his discovery that Cornelius is already a God-fearer. He's already a good person doing good things. Sometimes we can get the impression that the world out there is all bad. And actually, there's an awful lot of goodness out there. And I think that's been one of the discoveries many churches have made in this pandemic. The goodness in the community. There's been a lot of rubbish as well, a lot of nasty stuff. But communities across the country have demonstrated kindness and care. And sometimes, actually, the church has been running to catch up with what the community is really doing. And that, again, is a challenge, perhaps, to some of our thinking. Peter, of course, is very disturbed that the Spirit has fallen on the Gentiles. He really didn't think that the Spirit should be doing that. It's not for us to dictate what God is doing. So, how do we bring this together? In a sense, there's a double conversion going on here, isn't there? Yes, Cornelius is converted. This is wonderful good news for him and his household. But Peter is also converted. The Jerusalem church is also converted to a different way of thinking about God, about the world, about mission, about who they should be as a church. And that's when mission is at its best, when it's two-way. It's not a one-way street. It's not simply about us as followers of Jesus bringing good news to others. It's also about us discovering what God is already doing beyond us and learning from that. It's a two-way thing. And that makes mission a lot more exciting. One final point. The church is a place of comfort and familiarity for those of us who've been around in the church for a long time. It is not a place of comfort for people who are new to church. To walk in through those doors can be quite discomforting and threatening for people. However hard we try to make people feel welcome. Some churches are brilliant at welcoming people. I have no idea whether you are or not, because it's my first time here, but many churches are. But however hard we try, it is still an uncomfortable environment for people who are not used to it. And we just need to recognize that. And it does mean that mission is not simply about inviting people to come to where we're comfortable. It's about going to where people are comfortable and perhaps we're not. That's Peter's story here. He was very, very uncomfortable, but he needed to be where God was at work. An analogy that's sometimes used, for those who don't like football, forgive me and switch off for 30 seconds, but an analogy that's often used is that, well, you know the difference between playing away and playing at home. So if your side is playing at home, they have all the advantages. You know, they have the crowd behind them cheering them on. They know where the bumps in the pitch are. They've got their own changing. Everything is going for them. And it can be quite an intimidating environment for the away team. The reverse is true when you go away. And some have suggested that for hundreds of years, the church has been playing at home, expecting people to come to our turf, where we're comfortable. Maybe it's time we went away. Maybe it's time that we found ourselves in places of discomfort for the sake of the gospel. So, I bring you a challenge this morning. And one of the things I love about this passage, and it's a passage that Chris and Paul might remember we look at on Crucible, the Crucible course. One of the things I love about this passage is it seems to me to be a win-win. So Peter is affirmed, his pioneering is affirmed, but also the church makes a good call, a good decision. We have here a courageous church as well as a courageous pioneer. It's touch and go for a while. Not quite sure as you read Acts 11 which way it's going to go, but the church gets there. They say, yes, we sense that God is doing something new. We don't quite know what this means for us, but we're going to go with it. We believe that God is in this and leading us forward. And I think that's a wonderful story. A story of a pioneer and an accountable community who are on the same page and together are hearing what God is calling them into. So I hope that resonates in some way with you. I don't know much of your story. Of course, 376 years, there's lots of stories. But as you move into the next season, the next phase of that story, I hope you will do so with that sense of expectancy, perhaps a little bit of trepidation, because the God who calls us forward is a God who often discomforts us, rather than leaving us in a place of comfort. May God bless you as you move into your 377th year. Amen.